morning. On behalf of the California ISO, I'd like to welcome you to the Interconnection Process Enhancements 2021 Data Transparency Meeting. My name is Elisandra Castilla, representing the Stakeholder Affairs Group here at the California ISO, and I will be facilitating today's meeting. And I'm also joined by Jason Foster, Manager of Team Management. This presentation and other materials related can be found on the initiative webpage. Next slide, please. Some housekeeping reminders. This call is being recorded and the video file will be posted on the initiative webpage for information and convenience purposes only. The recordings and any related transcriptions should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. This meeting is structured to stimulate dialogue and engage different perspectives. Please keep comments professional and respectful. Also, in the interest of time, please try and be brief and refrain from repeating what has already been said so we can manage the time efficiently. Next slide, please. Instructions for questions. We will pause for questions periodically throughout the meeting. You can raise your hand by selecting the hand icon above the chat window in WebEx, or if you join via audio only, please press #2 on your device. Please state your name and affiliation first before making your comment. You may also send your question via chat to all panelists. If you need technical assistance during today's meeting, please send a chat to the event producer. Next slide, please. And from here, I will turn the meeting over to Jason Foster.
All right, thank you, Ellie. Appreciate that. And good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining in today. To kick this off, we are here to chat about the Interconnection Process Enhancements Data Transparency Request. This is a parallel stakeholder initiative that we are running with the IPE process to discuss the ability for stakeholders to obtain data from the ISO in different formats and analysis, and just discuss what can and potentially cannot be shared in a public forum or public way. One of the questions to be answered here is there a way to efficiently streamline some of the feeding of information that the CAISO provides in either a central point and in a consistent format? And today's objective is really to review and discuss what data the CAISO already provides and what locations and format. We'll also discuss maybe some opportunities, benefits, and potentially some limitations of the CAISO reformatting the data that it already has published out there. Just want to raise up here too, just before we dive in to this presentation, that the paper that was published earlier in May provides much more detail than we'll review today. So if you haven't read the paper, I encourage you to review that paper. The CAISO was able to and did respond to very specific stakeholder requests, both from the transmission data perspective, but also the queue publishing data perspective. This presentation is intended to be really high level, discuss more so kind of what the CAISO reviewed and where we're going forward with things here. So just to set that stage. And we can go to the next slide, please. All right, some of the considerations in the evaluation and our ability to publish data is one of the biggest key items here is the data currently considered confidential? We're taking the evaluation from either the tariff, do the interconnection customers or the generator owners consider data confidential? Does the ISO as an organization, or does the FERC deem certain information confidential? And is there the possibility of sharing information publicly without consensus of either the stakeholders or requiring tariff approval? One of the things we noticed in the request was stakeholders are seeking certain data in certain formats, and it's not really consistent between various stakeholders. So we're trying to determine, if we were to publish and format the data in one way, is it really going to please everybody, or are we going to be in the same situation we're in today, where we provide a lot of information, but it's not in the format that certain stakeholders are requesting it to be in? And then, of course, the data that's being requested isn't necessarily in a format that the CAISO already has that data available in. So there's then the resources that come into play with, the people hours that it takes. Is there technology updates that are required? How much time is necessary for the various resources to be able to reformat? And I think as we further discuss this, we're finding out that there seems to be a very significant undertaking with the ability to either republish the data or the needs behind technology updates and so forth. So more to come there, but certainly the considerations here that we're taking and looking at as we go through this effort. Next slide, please. All right. And for the sake of time, we only have a few of our panelists that are available until 11 o'clock. So I'm going to go through some general comments and then the transmission data sections, and then we'll pause for questions. So we have about 5 or 6 slides that we'll go through, and then we'll pause for questions and comments on those slides as a whole. So just in general, the ISO does understand, and we hear everybody loud and clear and understand the importance of the timeliness and accuracy of the data that all parties are requesting to efficiently and accurately evaluate such data for many various reasons. Overall, the CAISO will consider the following in its efforts of providing accurate and timely data. There was a few requests for the creation and use of unique identifiers for transmission upgrades, posting of the data that we are posting on the market participant portal as soon as possible following any of the given study processes, and then the evaluation of how to structure the transmission data that is published so that it can bring more value to not just stakeholders, but the ISO as well. One note we wanted to make here, a few stakeholders noted that the gaining access to the market participant portal was taking a significant amount of time. We did follow up with the onboarding process, and it should really only take about 30 days. That's assuming all documentation is filled out correctly and accurately and then submitted properly. So there's certainly going to be delays if there's back and forth between the CAISO and the stakeholder requesting that access. And on to the next slide, please. All right, specific on the topic of the Transmission Development Forum, there were a few stakeholder comments specific to items that are typically covered or are covered in the forum. The first thing that the ISO wants to note is that we do certainly appreciate the PTOs as well as the stakeholder support for the Transmission Development Forum. We do think it's a valued add to the stakeholder processes that we have and the information that's being provided. The ISO will continue the transmission construction status discussions in that forum, and then consistent with the paper, any items referenced in section 3 of the paper that was published really should be addressed via the Transmission Development Forum. And next slide, please. On the topic of Tpd allocation data, there was a number of questions on wanting to know, or stakeholders seeking, what Tpd is available at what locations, and then where has it run out. The ISO has recently published the Tpd Allocation Report, which does provide information regarding the availability of Tpd, as well as any constraints or known constraints that Tpd is behind. Additionally, the CAISO does publish or has published the Transmission Capabilities paper, which also provides additional Tpd or transmission plan availability information. There was a few stakeholder requests for PTO level summary and details on areas that do not trigger shared upgrades. The ISO does perform an operational deliverability assessment as part of the Phase 2 interconnection study process. This operation study is based on assumptions of the in-service dates and the delivery network upgrades identified in that cluster. And this information is provided on a cluster-by-cluster basis and really for informational purposes only for that cluster study process specifically. And next slide, please. And then there's 2 slides for transmission data specific. There's a number of items provided by stakeholders that we'll cover here. There's much more detail again in the paper, but phase 2 studies do examine the long lead network upgrades to determine if a project can connect without it. To do additional studies would add significant burden and time to really an already lengthy process, and the assumptions for the analysis would not be reliable at the time of the phase 2 studies. In addition, if there are network upgrades that are required for a project, we do have the limited operations study process that can be completed 5 months prior to a project coming online to determine if it can achieve sync or COD ahead of that network upgrade being completed. Specific to study area boundaries, the boundaries, as they're defined sometimes in the studies, are not strict identifier of the electrical boundaries, but they're typically based on very specific system study requirements and needs, and they can certainly change over time. So I think there's just some needed clarification there that those electrical boundaries can change and aren't necessarily specific to, they're not necessarily specific. There was a few requests to provide more specific substation and bay position data. The CAISO here is not privy to substation level details. And also these details can change with time as projects withdraw and new projects are proposed and system changes occur. So having the information at one time, it may be valuable for that moment, but certainly could change in any given instance. And then specific to mapping, the CAISO does publish a few maps that identify queue data by county, and then I think, as I understand it, there's also some other maps in a few various reports that are published that identify more specific data specific to that report. Just to say it here, the ISO is not prepared to develop a GIS mapping system to provide additional details or project-specific mapping resources. And then next slide, please. And then in the paper, there was a list of specific transmission data requests by various stakeholders. To note here, the ISO does provide much of this information in various sources, and it's not, right now, we're not prepared to restructure how it publishes this existing data, although we are willing to consider this in the future as we evaluate, of course, the cost, the resource requirements, and the benefits to not just the stakeholders, but also the ISO internally. And if we were able to restructure it, how would it be beneficial to everybody? And then also we'll determine and probably likely discuss this information as well in the ITE Phase 2 paper, which I'll take a note here. We'll note here in the next few slides as we get into that the CAISO is including a new section in the ITE Phase 2 paper to discuss data confidentiality and certain information that stakeholders are requesting that is currently considered confidential. So we've gotten through the transmission data topics. I think here is a good time to pause for questions.
Thank you, Jason. As a reminder, for questions, you can raise your hand by selecting the hand icon above chat window in WebEx, or if you've joined via audio only, please press #2 on your device. Please remember to state your name and affiliation before making your comment. And it looks like we do have a few lined up in queue. Operator, can you please open up their lines?
Yeah, hi, this is Susan Schneider, Phoenix Consulting. Can you hear me okay?
Yes. Hi, Susan. Good morning.
Morning. I just had a couple of questions. I wonder if you could go back. I think it is about, unfortunately, when these print out, they don't have the slide numbers, but if you could go back about 3 slides to where it talks about the TPD allocation data. Oh, there you go, right there. Okay. I had, just a couple of questions about where the TPD has run out. On the first item, the TPD allocation report is very helpful to tell people where the TPD allocation has run, or TPD has run out. But it doesn't actually tell you for the areas that have not run out how much is left. And I think that's what I mean. We do appreciate the report, and it is very helpful. But we're wondering if it'd be possible to have some information where, is in some areas, is it close? Is it, or there a lot? It helps to know where not to go, but it doesn't really help you to know where you should go or where the better places to go than the other places that have not run out. Does that make sense?
This is Jason.
Yeah, this is Robert.
Good question.
I can chime in on that if that's all right, Jason.
Yeah, please do.
Hi, Susan. So in the latest 2022 TPD allocation report, we tried to be responsive to that particular request from stakeholders, and we did include for the most part, the information that you're asking for all area constraints identified in the cluster, for the most part, cluster 13 phase 1. There may be a little gap here and there, but we did try to provide, the TPD available for all the constraints identified in cluster 13 phase 1. Now, in many cases, there was none available, but in some cases there was some available, and that was provided. Now, in some cases, the area constraints are nested within larger area constraints, and there's nothing provided, nothing available in the larger constraint, but within the inner nested constraint, there might have been something available, but since there was nothing in the larger constraint, we just didn't think that was really useful information since TPD generally was not available due to the overall more binding constraint. But basically, we did provide that information that you're asking for.
Okay, I didn't see that. So let me just ask a clarifying question though about what you just said. So if an area is nested in a larger area and the larger area doesn't have any left, that means the area itself doesn't have any left, right? I mean, you can't cite there and expect to get anything, all other things equal, which they probably aren't. But anyway, that's an indication though, if they're in that larger constraint, even though there could be some in that area, it means there just isn't any because you're within the larger constraint, right?
Yes, and the reason we provide both is because it's, probable, or maybe I should say possible, that an upgrade could be identified for the larger constraint, and we just want to indicate that that there are other constraints to be mindful of, even if the larger constraint is mitigated in the TPP, for example.
It would be good to get some information then, because like, for example, the Manning substation, there was some, you can sort of look at it and hypothesize that maybe the gates constraint or something might go away if you have that, but you can't really tell. Can you not really tell either? Is there a way to say, oh, well, because this was approved in the TPP, then the next time around, perhaps that constraint might not apply? Is there any way to know that?
So the 2022 TPD allocation study and report were all done prior to the board approval of the 2021-2022 TPP projects.
Uh-huh.
And so I think you said, did you say Manning substation?
Yeah, I guess is there anything way to know that there were a few upgrades approved in the transmission plan, as you said, after the TPD allocation? Is there any way to know going into the next one if maybe those would help with some of the constraints? Is there any way to draw that line?
Oh, okay. Well, what I was trying to just finish was that, so Manning substation, I believe that was one of the projects approved in the TPP, and forgive me, I focus on the south mostly.
Yeah, it is, yeah, it was, that's right.
And you're right, and that project was not able to be included in the TPD allocation, in the 2022 TPD allocation report. So anyway, so it sounds like you already know that. I just want to make sure everybody knows that.
Yes, I do know that.
And so now you're asking, okay, we know it wasn't in there, but can you prepare another report, do another study, and provide more information to stakeholders about that? Well,
my question was not really that exactly. My question was whether, without having to do a whole other study, is there any way to know? There are a few upgrades that were approved in the TPP. Is there any way to know, without, like I said, without doing a whole bunch more work? But is there any way you can know? Oh yeah, well this upgrade should help relieve that constraint that was there last in the 2021-2022 allocation process.
Well, I guess we try not to speculate and put it out there because that can mislead people possibly. And but what I was going to say was that in the 2022-2023 TPP, we will be modeling all those upgrades and providing information about their benefits.
Right, and I understand that too.
So hopefully that should get to that information.
Yeah. Is there any way to know before we get to the allocation? Because people have to try and make decisions about what they're electing and, with the new groups and everything.
Well, in the TPP results should be like in the November TPP stakeholder meeting, which is before the allocation.
No, I'm saying, yes, I know that, but is there any way to say, you identified, I don't know, there's 15 constraints in the 2022 Tpd Allocation Report. And then there were some upgrades that were approved in the TPP. Is there any way to know, without having to do a whole nother study, that these, let's call them 4 upgrades, I don't remember how many there were, but there's like 4, something like that, 4 upgrades approved in the TPP that should go toward alleviating, out of those 15 constraints, these 4 or something, or these 2 or something. Is there any way to be able to connect the dots that way, or is that something that requires a whole nother study?
Well, Robert, I guess my answer is yes, and I think that will be indicated in the November stakeholder meeting. I hope we'll see what information becomes available. It depends on the portfolios and that sort of thing, but in terms of where the portfolios are driving constraints and those upgrades being modeled, that should reveal some of the information you're asking for. So in that context, I think the answer is yes. But I think pretty sure Jeff's on, and he is more familiar with the North, and he may have a better answer anyway.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I think the answer really, Robert, is kind of what you hit there. Is that to get those, Susan, we will have to go through the appropriate study to get the information that you're looking for, and then through the TPP, and that's when that information will become available. Trying to speculate and hypothesize as to what may, I don't think is the appropriate that's there. So the answer is through the studies as we're going through it in the TPP, and then as we continue, that's where those results that you're looking for will come from. There isn't anything that to be able to provide at this time.
Okay, so you're saying you think the information in the November TPP meetings will be able to tie back to the 15 constraints. I'm going to just call it 15. I don't know how many there were, but 15 constraints in the 2022 Tpd Allocation Report, and you'll be able to, from that information, try and figure out which constraints might not apply anymore because of the new upgrades that were assumed. I'm not trying to give you a hard time. I'm just asking the question.
Well, we'll put those projects in the transmission planning process. We'll assess them. You got to remember that they're assessed against the portfolio, and the queue is what multiple times greater than what is in the portfolio. But we'll do the assessment as part of the transmission planning process with those projects in service and as we go forward and assessing the constraints.
Okay, I'm gonna try and write this down because I don't think I'm asking this exactly very clearly for you. So let me go on to the next question. The additionally, where it says additionally the transmission capability paper, is this the paper that the CAISO provides to the CPUC before the CPUC puts its portfolios together?
Yes.
I think it's called that. Okay. And we had a little bit of a dialogue back and forth on whether the transmission capabilities paper, we were trying to look to the cost for the upgrades and the additional the cost for additions, and then the additional deliverability that might provide when we came into the TPP process this past cycle. And we were told that while it had that information, it didn't necessarily mean that you could spend that money and get that amount of additional deliverability, because there might be local constraints, or there might be other things, or it was not exactly here, but you couldn't really look at that and see, well, for X dollars you could get X more megawatts of deliverability, but there was some reason why you actually couldn't make that translation. So is there a way to sort of try and navigate that so we actually could look at that report for that purpose?
Well, I mean, that is the purpose of the report, in terms of that's why we provide it to the CPUC. But you have to realize there's, on the order of 30 constraints in that report. And it could be that a particular generator location is behind more than one constraint. So you have to check all the constraints, look at the diagrams. For that report, the diagrams are posted on the MPP, the report's posted on the public website. But on the MPP, there's diagrams of all the constraints. Check where your particular point of interconnection is that you're interested in. Look at the diagram, see which constraints you're behind. And you need to fix all the constraints that that point of interconnection is behind, if you will. You can't just fixing one may not produce the desired outcome. You need to fix the all the constraints. Now, it's true there could be some LDNUs, I suppose, but those generally should be lower cost and shorter lead time projects. The big ticket items are intended to be the area constraints, and that transmission capability report is meant to address all the area constraints that we identified in the most recent cluster, or even previous ones. We tend to carry them forward.
Okay.
But, there's no guarantee. Sorry. You need to go through the queue and follow the process, basically, to get a guarantee. And even then, there's some, issues along the way, as you know.
Well, yeah, we weren't looking for anything for any particular generator. We tried to pick out, say, upgrades that would be less than 5 years, and that would provide, look like for the cost, they would provide a lot of deliverability. And which is what I think you're saying here, should provide, that's sort of an availability, information from that report. But we were told that you can't really do that. There was one upgrade we picked up that was, it was low cost. It would provide 2,000 megawatts of deliverability for X dollars. And it would take less than 5 years. So we were trying to screen the information in that report in that way, but we're told that you couldn't really do that. So are you saying that you actually can do that? Or am I I don't know.
So I'm speculating that, none of this information is perfect. So you might have asked about a particular location where the information was maybe even less perfect than normal. But generally, that is the purpose of that information. There are always exceptions. And then when you start cornering us on a particular place where it wasn't perfect, we're going to start making general statements of, well, you can't do that. But generally, you can.
Okay, so you should be able to identify where it says if there's X dollar, a particular upgrade would cost X dollars and provide X amount of, Y amount of deliverability. That would be an okay statement to make based on the information in that report. We're not trying to corner you to do anything. We're just trying to get, understand the information.
Well, I think just one other comment, Susan, on there too, is it's Jeff here again, is when you're quoting to say if I do this upgrade, it gets X megawatts of upgrades, that's where the nested component becomes critical that you have to understand and go down. And if the resources that you're looking at are all in that nested area, and you provide the upgrade to the larger constraint, you may get no upgrade, no increased capacity because it's still nested behind other upgrades that are required. And so you have to look at the entire picture as opposed to each one as an individual by itself.
Well, so how can the CPC know what to do with this if some of these are dependent on other parts of these, and you can't?
Because they're looking at they're looking at the nested component when they're looking at it.
Okay. Okay. Let me move on to something else.
And they're building those portfolios for the purpose of being studied in the transmission planning process. So the final answer comes out once they're studied in the transmission planning process. Now, if there are surprises, then we have to deal with that. But anyway, they're just building portfolios. They're not approving transmission projects.
Okay. All right. Can you move on to the next page, please? I just have one or two more questions, and I want to give somebody else a chance. The phase 2 studies that examine long lead time NUs, I mean, I know it's been a little while since we had a phase 2 study, but I'm not aware that it actually does that. Are you saying that the phase 2 studies are taking out long lead time NUs to see if a particular project can connect, or if how many projects in the cluster, or and then your next statement says this would add a significant burden. So are you saying you already do it, or you don't do it and you're not going to? I was a little confused about this bullet point and the sub bullet as well.
So, generally in the phase, I think what we're talking about there are the operational deliverability study, and we do an operational reliability studies too in the phase 2. And so we look at kind of like Jason was describing in his slides. We look at all the generators in the queue in that area, and when their stated commercial operation dates are, and we look at also the transmission projects, the LDNUs and the RNUs are in there as well, and then we check to see if these generators as they come on year by year will be deliverable, taking into account when the transmission projects are coming online. And so the long lead time projects tend to be further out and beyond the generator's desired CODs. And so from that result, you can see whether or not you're going to be deliverable without that project. And with it, you are deliverable because we already provided that information. So that, I think, is what we're getting at. And we're also doing that with the reliability projects. And a lot of it's on a cluster by cluster basis, as we did mention. So we'll basically say that, clusters 11 and 12 will be deliverable even before this upgrade comes in service. The cluster 13 will not be deliverable, or cluster 12, can come online without these breaker replacements or these short circuit mitigation, but cluster 13 cannot come online. That's the nature of the information.
Okay, well, I'm familiar with the operational deliverability assessments, but I don't recall seeing anything that talks about like the RNUs that it can come online before a certain amount of the generation, or this generator or some subset of the cluster or any of the cluster could come online without the long lead time RNUs. Are you saying that those are? Again, I apologize if I just completely missed it, but I don't recall seeing those in there. So are you doing them for CODs as well as deliverability?
Well, and so with the RNUs, it might be the case, at least in previous years, we've had some surprises lately, but in previous years it was more as generators come online, it determined the timing for the short circuit mitigation, and so therefore we were just trying to determine when to pull the trigger to move forward with the short circuit mitigation. Now we have been surprised, and it turns out that we're, I guess, maybe behind on some short circuit mitigation, and so maybe we need to update our processes there. In some cases, that we don't know the in-service dates of the short circuit mitigation because we got surprised by it, and so there's a little bit of a vacuum of information there. But usually when the short circuit mitigation we know is delaying the CODs, we start providing information of which ones can come online, which ones cannot, and we'll endeavor to provide more of that when it's needed. But the main thing is we try and get the short circuit mitigation done so that nobody has to wait, and of course, unfortunately, in some areas that's not possible.
Well, some of these have had short circuit duty things that have come either very late in the process after the phase 2 study, and some of them have come even after CGIAs have been signed. But I guess my question is, are you going to be then in the phase 2, and there could be other RNUs too, but are you going to be adding an operational? I mean, basically, when they look at the earliest achievable COD, they take the longest lead time RNU. They don't usually say, well, let's say you don't have to have that RNU, then what would happen? I haven't seen it before where there's been a calculation where you could do it without all the RNUs, for example, for COD. So are you going to be trying to put those in the phase 2 studies now, or have you been doing it and I just missed it, or is that going to be part of it?
No, that is, you're right. Typically you have to have the RNUs before you can come online, but there is still, the possibility that a cluster includes a number of generation projects, and it's possible that maybe half of them could come online before triggering the short circuit duty problem. But
yeah, that's
because
what
we did it by cluster, we triggered it. So that's what you're getting at. And
yeah.
I think we have been providing more of that information, but again, that wasn't in the past. That wasn't quite as much of an issue. So the reports, we try and improve them, and that probably is one of the improvements we'll try and get in there. And I think in some cases we have been doing that. But that's probably one area where we do agree we'll include that information when it's needed.
Okay, and then your sub-bullet then was confusing to me, because then it said if you actually are providing this information or you're planning to provide it, then the second sub-bullet says it would be a significant burden and it wouldn't be accurate anyway. So it seemed like these two things were saying, two lines were saying two different things.
Well, that's, I'm talking more about the situation where we have these surprises. You didn't know you had this upgrade, or anyway, I guess there's some exceptions, I suppose, but so yeah, we may not always provide the information. Like for cluster 14, phase 1, we're not going to go and provide information of who can come online and who can't, and essentially we'll tell you, these upgrades are going to take a certain amount of time, and this is your feasible COD, and to go and try and figure out which projects can come online if we don't ever need this upgrade, and there's just too many what ifs. So it's more in the situation where it is practical to provide that information, we will, but some cases it's not practical. I don't know. You have.
Yeah, no, I think that's kind of one way. We'll look to see what we can, but we can't provide all of the information, I don't think, Susan, that you're looking for. And that's part of also in terms of why we have the limited operational study is some of that requires that level of detail and the assessment to determine that. So we'll look to see where
in sync. It's really too late to make any decisions on that basis, really.
And some of the information though can't be provided in as we're looking at it as well, and requires the limited operation. That's why it's there. So we'll have a look to see if there's something that we can on the RNUs and consistency. But like I said, it is not all on the reliability can, because that's the purpose of the limited operational study as well.
Okay. And then my last question is that where it says the CAISO is not privy to substation level details, we're talking about the CAISO control grid and assets that belong to it, right? We're not talking about distribution substations. I mean, we know that.
Well, I think the purpose of that is that the PTOs do that work. So there's no sense in the ISO trying to go do the work. So the PTOs have all the information. We can get it, I suppose, but it's not our responsibility to do the reliability studies. We review their work on the reliability studies. I forget the exact, more specific substation data. I forget exactly what this ask was, but it seemed like it was I guess asking for possibly confidential information that the PTOs may not be eager to provide.
Well, I mean, we understand that there's some, that you may not have, but I guess I don't remember exactly what the ask was here either, but it just seemed like a strange statement that you weren't privy to details for CAISO control grid assets. And if you'd asked them to provide it, perhaps they, in a phase 2 study or something, perhaps that they could provide it. So again, this is more of a general observation, but it just was strange. I thought it was just strangely stated. If you ask for information on CAISO control grid substations, things like that you should get it. Now, whether it's a confidential, critical energy infrastructure, that's a whole nother question. But it seems strange that you wouldn't be able to get data that it was for the CAISO control grid. So anyway, it's just a general comment. I obviously understand the second part of that. So okay, let me get off here and let somebody else ask some questions. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Susan. Susan, this is Jason. Just to chime in on that last piece, I know one of the requests for this specific substation or bay position data was somebody requested very specific bay position openings and things like that, and really, this is the information that we don't house in-house at the ISO. Those are the discussions that are intended to be for either the scoping meetings upon an initial interconnection request application, or maybe even during the results meetings sort of situations, right? This is not information that the CAISO or the PTOs, I think, intend to publish. And it's specific, there's all of this information in bay position openings change, and specific substation information changes so rapidly that reporting something today likely would be different for tomorrow.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Thanks, Susan.
We do have one more caller in the queue. Operator, can you please unmute their line? It looks like your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, this is Songjue Zhu from Greenbright. I have a few questions as well. First one is a very high level, just to confirm my understanding. For this data transparency initiative, there's no immediate action coming out of it. Instead, you have a topic in phase 2 for confidentiality of the data. Is that right?
Yes, that is correct. Yeah, there's no immediate action or nothing immediately that's being published or changed per se from this data transparency side initiative from IPE. We are including a new topic in IPE phase 2 to discuss confidential information being requested.
Okay, thank you. So the next one is probably more for Robert regarding the Tpd allocation report. So first, it's just a comment. First one. So we do like this report that include all the nested constraints information that was very helpful. But we want just one comment that probably be more consistent across all the areas in the ISO. So we have the same level of information everywhere. And then some more specific question. So when you report the deliverability constraint, the overload, the facility, could you also add in which study area and under which scenario, either HSN or SSN, this overload was identified? so that we can easily compare our results with ISO's results. Sometimes it's confusing. Is this from the current area or is it reported from Fresno area? Then another question is, in the Tpd allocation report, at the very beginning, you have a table that summarizes all the Tpd candidates at the PTO level. Could you provide the same level of information regarding the allocation results? So it's almost the same table, but instead of the number of candidates, showing the number and the megawatt of the candidate that have received allocation as in this cycle. So that's all my questions.
Sounds like there really aren't any questions in there. I'm assuming you're going to provide all that in writing, Sonja?
I already, except for that study area and the scenario, yeah, I already provide the last one in my comments in the previous one.
To the extent that there's comments being, are there any comments being accepted for this meeting, Jason?
Yes, we are accepting stakeholder comments for this.
Yeah. So it might be nice just to copy them from last time and resend them in, since again they're not really questions; they're just requests, I suppose.
Yeah, I just think those shouldn't increase ISO's workload too much. Just a little bit additional information would be helpful. Then the last question is, or comment is about the study boundary. I understand you said the study boundary is specific to certain study and may change over time, but just in each phase 2 report or phase 1 report for this particular study, you should be able to clearly define the area boundary. If they say Fresno area report, then what is considered Fresno area? That information need to be more specific. Right now, it is very vague. The new IP, the short-term change, for the new IR, if they want to change POI immediately after the scoping meeting, that POI change is limited to the same study area. So the developers need to know what is considered the same study area. If that information can be found in the latest phase 2, phase 1 report, that would be very helpful.
Okay, yeah, I didn't think about that part. But I just wanted to make sure, and I know you know this, Sonja, but those study areas, other than maybe the point you just brought up, don't really mean much. Cost allocation doesn't end at the study area boundary, which is the main point of all these studies. I just didn't want stakeholders to believe that their cost allocation was limited within that boundary.
Yeah, understood that. Mm-hmm.
I forgot about, I guess you can't change your POI. I think that's what the change was outside the area, or at least can't even ask for it, I guess. Yeah, I suppose since we have that rule, that there is justification to put in the extra effort in the other PTO areas. But again, if please submit that one in writing it too, just so we have a little bit of a checklist.
I'll do that again. Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's all my questions.
Great. Thank you, Sandra.
We do have an additional caller in the queue. Jerry, your line is connected.
Happy post-Memorial Day. This is Jerry Melcher with the Public Advocate Office. How's everybody doing?
Yeah, doing well, Jerry. Thanks.
All right. First of all, most times when I get involved in databases, there's usually a data dictionary that goes with the database so that you know which the fields are and maybe even the source. So I don't know if there's any addition along that line that could take place so that, when you go into a database, you've got some idea what the pieces are that make up that database. Anyway, going on my next question or comment. On the 20th, Neil Miller gave a slide covering the transmission capacity that exists on the ISO. And I was wondering how any of the information we've been talking about was used in generating that report at the CEC-hosted Joint Agency Workshop on summer and midterm reliability. I don't know if you guys have seen that. They indicated that for solar and storage, there's about 8 gigawatts of capacity that was available. And across all resources, 11.5 gigawatts are available with no transmission upgrades or capacity was available from RAS application or RAS schemes. So you guys familiar with that
yes.
report?
And that's actually being updated right now, but yes.
So where's the source of that information coming from?
It's posted on the ISO website, and the data that, like Robert said, was previously, or what Neil quoted and is in the process of being updated, is currently posted on the ISO website.
Okay.
The data comes from the generation interconnection study process.
Yeah, when you say posted on the ISO website, that's not very specific.
Yeah, I'd have to look at the chat
or send it out.
Yeah, we'll look and see. We'll put it into the chat. But it is on the ISO website and has been studied before that. But I will plan to put it in the chat there.
Yeah, I mean, the criticality here is we all know we've got to do this, changeover in resource types, and that, we're being driven extremely hard to pay for, transmission upgrades. And I don't know, with stakeholders like the ones that Susan represents, but at least for the LSEs, if they know, hey, we got these projects that can come online faster, it doesn't cost stakeholders any more money to, in transmission upgrades, I think we should all focus on that. I looked at the transmission capability estimates, and I couldn't get the same data out of that, which Neil showed at the meeting. So, how do decision makers and stakeholders and LSEs, CCAs, how do they make, decisions without, timely and accurate data showing that, hey, I can get this project online fast? Of course, it has to deal with, an RFP, a purchase power agreement, and what's the price of the resource. But still, there's a lot of, we've gone through the step function of going to adding 1 gigawatt of new resources a year, and now we're supposed to add 4. So I don't know how we get through that bottleneck very quickly. The other thing is I think I asked earlier in another meeting about WDAT and how it gets factored into, capacity on the transmission system. And I had a note here at the same joint agency meeting from Gary Holdsworth that says, CAISO does factor in WDAT for RA purposes in the deliverability allocation process. And so, I'm really seeing a lot of WDAT requests, and how does that get factored into either lowering the need for additional capacity in a transmission in an area? Because, eventually all WDAT is operated by the CAISO. So if they're coming in and they're saying, hey, we want to be on this circuit 138, but we're coming in as a WDAT, I don't know how you guys will factor that into transmission deliverability going forward. But that's about all my questions at this time. Thanks.
So I wanted to just go back to where you started with that, and you're right. The information that Neil is providing and being updated is to address the need that you identified, which is to provide information about what resources have already gone through the generation interconnection process, and most of those have well, I should say, but a huge segment of those have been given TPD allocation, and those are the ones that if you're looking for deliverability that you would want to select from. There's another big chunk of those that are energy only, and all that information will be updated in the information that is being updated by the ISO and should be provided shortly. So, and that is the purpose, is, you know, because those are the resources to go after, not the ones that are just getting into cluster 14, at least not right now. The ones to go after right now are the ones who've already made it through the process, have a TPD allocation or have an LGIA and they're energy only. So you're right on target with that. The WDATs, like Gary Holdsworth said, are in the ISO deliverability studies, and that transmission that they utilize is taken into account, but you do need to also coordinate with the PTOs because on the WDATs, because those are in their queue, not on ours. But we coordinate with them as well, especially with the deliverability studies. But it is probably a little more work because you need to work with the PTOs and the ISO on the WDATs information.
I appreciate your input very much. Thanks, guys and gals.
Thank you, Jerry. There are no additional callers in the queue. Please proceed.
All right. Thank you, Ellie. If we can go to slide 11. All right. Specific to interconnection queue data and site exclusivity, I'll note here first that the topics identified in, or I should say many of the topics identified in the paper are now being included in the Interconnection Process Enhancements Phase 2 paper. Here, stakeholders have requested very specific project level data where the ISO and potentially other stakeholders deem this data as confidential. And we are concerned that not all generator owners would agree with sharing their project specific details. And we are seeking stakeholder feedback through that Phase 2 paper. Here, kind of to make two notes. One, we just want to be clear that we're not providing a guarantee that we would provide or publish such information being identified in the paper, but we're certainly willing to entertain the discussion and evaluate the situation and the data. And we are looking for really specific interconnection customer and generator owner feedback specific to their project specific information. And I'll cruise through the next two slides and then we can pause there again for questions. So can we go to the next slide, please? And for queue cleanup and the use of RIMs, the ISO does support the idea to provide, support the ideas provided in an effort to clean up the queue. We, the queue management team, the interconnection resources team, as well as the new resource implementation team, do make significant efforts to ensure the projects continue to progress towards commercial operation. We have many items here listed to help us get there. However, we are on some level constrained to operating within the bounds and the tariff, bounds of the tariff and the GIAs. The use of RIMs and ongoing maintenance, all the teams I just noted do continue to use RIMs for the interconnection process, and we do try and work hard and will continue to work hard to continuously update RIMs with project-specific data as it's studied and approved to ensure that the information in RIMs is in fact the latest and greatest that we have available. And the next slide, please. And then the use, there was a comment on the use of RINs for MMA processing. Right now, the key management team is working towards uploading all MMA results into RINs and using RINs as that records retention, and then evaluating more efficient ways to process and transfer or save files that are utilized between the ISO and the PTOs related specifically to MMA requests and approval letters. Okay, and that is really the conclusion of the presentation. I'll pause here for any additional questions or comments.
As a reminder,
go ahead, Ellie.
As a reminder for questions, you can raise your hand by selecting the hand icon above the chat window in WebEx, or if you've joined via audio only, please press #2 on your device. Please remember to state your name and affiliation first before making your comments. We'll go ahead and pause for just a moment.
And Ellie, while we're paused, it looks like there's, for everybody's information, there was some links published in the chat window for those interested.
Thank you, Jason. It looks like we do have Susan in the queue. Operator, can you please unmute Susan's line?
Yeah, hi. I'm looking in the chat room, and all I see is something says it is located on the main interconnection webpage. I'm sorry, what is it? And I know you were talked about some other information you were going to post there about the Neil's presentation. Is that what that is? Can you hear me okay?
Hi, Susan. Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay.
I see Bob Emmer posted something there, and then Ellie, it looks like you copy-pasted it potentially. I don't know if Robert or Jeff, I think Jeff had to drop off.
We were having an internal conversation. Hey, can you hear me? I don't think I'm on mute. Yeah, so Susan, if you were to go and look for the ISO interconnection queue on the ISO website, I'm assuming you've done that before. You go to basically planning, generation interconnection, and then there you can see there's a link there to get the interconnection queue. Right below that is a briefing on resources available for near-term interconnection. And I believe that's the presentation that we just asked about.
It's on the interconnection queue page?
I'm sorry, go ahead.
It's on the interconnection queue page. Now I'm not seeing anything in the chat room. I apologize if maybe I'm just not close the chat panel. Now I'm opening the chat panel. All right. Anyway. Okay. I'll figure it out. I'm sorry, but you're saying it's if you look for the interconnection queue, it's on that page?
Yeah, that's what it looks like to me.
Okay, I'll check it out. I'm sure I can find it. Thanks. I don't see it in the chat room now though, so I'm not sure if okay. Oh, there's something. Okay. All right. So it's under the generator interconnection /default. Okay, I do see it now. All right. Thank you. I'll find it.
And that will be updated here fairly soon, so I wouldn't bother printing that one out.
Will there be a market notice of some kind, or how will we know what's the right version?
Probably. I'm not sure. But I mean, the whole point is to make the information available. So I would say with a reasonable level of confidence that there will be a market notice. We want this information out there. We want, LSEs to be looking at these resources and procuring them for the near term rather than going and signing a contract with a Cluster 14 project and saying, oh, there's no transmission because this won't get transmission for 5 years.
Okay. All right. I guess we'll just keep an eye on it. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Looks like we have one additional caller in the queue. Your line is now muted. Please go ahead.
Hi, Sam Bustios with STG here. Can you hear me just fine?
Hi, Sam. Yes.
Yeah, I just want to ask a little bit more on the ISO's response about the logic for generation types. It says there's currently no logic to what's considered identified first, second, third, and would require all interconnection customers to fill out the document in a certain way. And I just want to make sure that we're talking about the same word form. This is the Appendix 1 interconnection request, right?
Yeah, that's correct. So just to expand on that thought, there's no, when we say logic, there's no logic for how that information is parsed over from that Appendix 1 document into RIMS. So just because it's first on the list in the IR form doesn't necessarily mean it's first on the list from a development or study perspective.
So you're saying that RIMS will automatically parse from the Word form, the Appendix 1, in order to fill in what's Gen Type 1, Gen Type 2. Is that what you're saying?
That's correct, or at least that's my understanding.
Okay. And the order of the generation that's within the form doesn't really translate over to the order that ends up in RIMS for the types. Is that correct?
That's correct. Or not necessarily the order of development or in which it'll come online.
Sure, sure. I guess I'm just trying to see how, like, if the system is automatically pulling in these values from the Word form, would it's not consistent in the way that the actual programming of the RIM system in order to pull in that megawatts? Because our proposal was to basically include storage as last unless it's the only type. And it would follow that if it was done that way, which the form, section C, is done that way, in which starts with cogeneration, combined cycle, fuel cell, and then goes all the way through basically storage being last unless it's other. So it seems like that if the system at least just pulled it in the way that it was filled out, it wouldn't really require the customer to fill it out in any specific way because it's already set up that way in the order in which the form is built. So I'm just trying to understand a little bit more on what the, I guess, either logic or lack of logic is coming from within RIMS.
Yeah, to note too, we actually have some internal discussions going on updating the interconnection request forms that'll be used for cluster 15 going forward. And then I'll take your note down. I believe Linda writes on the phone, and she's been actually leading most of this effort on the IR form. And maybe it's a discussion that we can have with our IT teams to order them in a certain order. Though I think there might be varying, I'll say, comments, if you will, on the order in which fuel type, resource type should be listed. So I'm not sure we have full consensus on what that looks like, but certainly we can take that back and provide those suggestions to IT to see if they can list them in any one given order, if we can find consensus on what that order would be.
Yeah, that'd be great. I mean, even if it was just in the order in which it's shown on the form now, if it just started top to bottom instead of random or whatever order it's currently doing it, at least then it would be consistent.
Yep, understood. Thanks, Sam.
Yep. I do have one other question. It's also on the form. One of the responses with the ISO is not really in a position to utilize something other than this form, but it sounds like maybe you guys are exploring something different for the interconnection request. And I can understand, let's say if RIMS is, hard-coded to pull information from this form that's in a specific order, format, what have you. But there are other methods to, let's say, fill that form in. I mean, one of the things was, there's too many POIs to, list it within a Word form. Sure, understandable, but there are other software, other systems that could be used, let's say, as the application, like a user interface, a module that then could fill in the Word version, the Word form. Let's say if you have to use this Word form in the format it's in, you could utilize something different in order to fill in that Word form. And it would then also help drive the consistency that we're looking for within the interconnection request, and the data that's going to end up there could also include, any number of POIs and the information, the naming convention, and would hopefully save your teams the time of manually entering a lot of this information, from what I understand from the ISO team. So just another thought there. We can continue to put stuff in comments, but we're very big in advocating for another system other than these manual entry word forms.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. We very much understand and appreciate that. We're very in favor of not doing things manually as well. Though to comment on the first thing of what you said is RIMS is, I'll use the term you used, hard-coded per se to utilize that Word document and parse the data from the interconnection request form and kind of develop the RIMS page for that project. And we'll certainly take your comments. Your comments in the first paper were very loud and clear. We very much understand them, but we'll certainly take those into consideration as we, continue to develop RIMS and look at some automation, as we develop into the IT processes.
Sounds good. And my last one is just that your response was that you don't really have a kind of a process map or anything due to limited usage for RIMS. I don't really understand the response too much, but really understanding what that essential connection is. Like, I understand there's a lot of emphasis in RIMS, and the RIMS process enhancements, the stakeholder process that happens around RIMS is a lot around the NRI process. And really what we're looking for is better data management, better file management at the interconnection request side, and see that there is a clear gap that happens between us processing applications, performing studies, doing subsequent MMAs, and then the process that happens even from a PTO side is a separate group that does the work with NRI, 84 days, some around prior to in-service, that are uploading files into RIMS for the full network model that is completely separate than the files we're even using in the interconnection request. So we're just trying to understand, mainly so we can provide some very pointed and very, constructive comments to this process, to understand what is it where that essential connection resides, so that we can figure out, is there another way for us to manage files and processes and different things at the upfront of the interconnection request that doesn't necessarily have to be exactly in a certain format and have to hard code it into RIMS a certain way, because there's another section on the NRI full network model that is really separate from these processes that we go through. So I just ask that Kaisa looks at those comments a little bit more. I can resubmit these comments again, but really trying to understand what those connections are.
Yeah, we did discuss it internally. Unfortunately, I think the answer is really the interconnection side of the house, or app and study side of RIMS, is separate from the gen side or NRI side of RIMS, and they are two separate. They're the same application, but they're two really separate, for lack of better terms, processes, if you will, right? So we have the interconnection side where we do the application and then the modifications and utilize app and study for that, and then the online process happens through NRI. Unfortunately, they are two separate processes that really require two separate uploads and uses per se. So we hear that loud and clear. Unfortunately, in the short term, we're not prepared to combine them into one larger process or application, but I think it's something that we can certainly evaluate over time and look at as we update, if you will, or continue our process improvements.
Sure, and I guess the question really is not so much in the hopes of getting to a single combine where you would utilize it for everything, but the response that we got, back in phase one is that, ISO is not in the position to move away from RIMS, but it seemed that the reason why maybe there's not the ability to move away from RIMS is because RIMS is very essential for the NRI process, for the full network model, but is maybe not as essential for the app and study. And to your point, if these really are two separate processes, could you consider that the app and study could be done not within RIMS because there is a lot of limitations, because there's a lot of restrictions, because it's not very easily accessible by the ICs as we go through the process, because your teams are having to manually upload things there? Maybe
Sure.
Keeping the RIMS portion that's for NRI as is, but then looking to utilize a third party other application for the app and study is again why we're looking to understand these connections.
Yeah. Yeah. Your comments are understood. I'll just kind of make one last comment, right? Internally, and I don't think stakeholders, including PTOs or customers, can see, but internally we have many connections and links between App and Study and Gen to tie data together based on the processes. But that's more of an internal use than it is an external use. So there is some internal connections there, but understand your comments and suggestions.
Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Sam.
We do have one more caller in the queue. Operator, can you please unmute Susan?
Yeah, hi, Susan Schneider, Phoenix Consulting. And I just have one more question about the interconnection queue since we have a few minutes. There were some suggestions were made by several parties to look at how the fuel types are listed and the POIs and how they're stated, and to make sure there's some consistency there. And is that being considered, or is that not feasible?
Yeah, so I'm trying to figure out how to frame that. So the consistency on the POIs is something that we the various groups within the ISO try and maintain some consistency on. Unfortunately, it's not an automated or a drop-down selection, so it's consistent across the board. We just don't have that built into the system yet. Is it possible that we could get there? Maybe, but today we don't have that capability.
Okay, and what about the fuel listings where some of them are listed as, this one first and the other one second, and there was a suggestion to put in, say, a solar column, a wind column, a storage column, that kind of thing, and sort of reformatting the data in that way. Is that not possible either?
And are you talking about on the queue report, Susan?
Yes, I am on the queue listings.
Yeah, so I don't think the queue report identifies a solar column and so forth, but it does, if I'm understanding correctly, I believe the queue report has fuel type 1, 2, and 3, and then some sorting and filtering can be done to identify the different fuel types. But no, right now at least, there is not a specific column for solar or each fuel type.
Right. Well, I think that was, I think the question was more related to the sorting capability, where if you can't sort by fuel type 1 or fuel type, if you can sort it that way, but then sometimes if everything's a different order, it just makes it hard to do that, because sometimes the solar's in the first column and the storage in the second column, sometimes it's the other way around. And I know that was discussed before. I was just wondering if that was still on the table.
Yeah, that's the same topic Sam was bringing up previously.
I thought so.
Unfortunately, yeah. No, that's okay. And the data as it's parsed from the Interconnection Appendix 1 application is, I do kind of air quotes around random into RINs, and then RINs then only sees it as fuel type 1, 2, and 3, and then is published on the queue report. So we understand this. We do the same filtering and sorting on our end as well when we're reviewing that data. So we kind of have the same struggles, if you will, on what you're speaking to. It's something that we're looking at internally, but it's just not the capability that we have at our fingertips today.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. There are no additional callers in the queue.
All right. Sounds good. I think we can go ahead and wrap up. Ellie, do you want to take it from here?
Absolutely. Thank you, Jason. Next slide, please. As a reminder, please submit comments on today's meeting discussion by June 14th using the commenting tool located on the initiative webpage. In addition, the ISO is scheduled to publish the revised draw proposal for the Phase 2 initiative on June 7th. For additional information on the ICE 2021 initiative, please visit the initiative webpage. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact us at ISO Stakeholder Affairs at ISO.com. Next slide, please. Before we close today's meeting, the ISO is pleased to announce this year's Stakeholder Symposium, which will be held in person at the Safe Credit Union Convention Center in downtown Sacramento on November 9th and 10th. Registration for the event will be open in June, and a public notice will be issued once the site is available. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact us at symposiumreg@kiso.com. Thank you for joining today's discussion. As a reminder, this meeting was recorded for informational and convenience purposes only. The video file will be posted on the initiative webpage for a limited time after this meeting. We look forward to receiving your comments and have a great rest of your day. Operator, you may now conclude the call.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using Event Services. You may now disconnect.